She wasn't supposed to be there. That was the thought that kept cycling through Vivienne Brooke's mind as the truck pulled off the highway and onto a gravel road she'd never seen before. The driver, a man from the agency who hadn't spoken more than 12 words since the airport, glanced at her once in the rearview mirror and then back at the road. The land outside the window was flat and wide and so relentlessly open that she felt exposed just looking at it. She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass and watched Alberta roll past her like something out of a photograph she'd never thought to take. She was 26 years old. She had a master's degree in landscape architecture from Dalhousie, a storage unit in Halifax full of things she couldn't bring herself to throw away, and, as of 4 months ago, a dead engagement and a bank account that made her stomach hurt to look at. She also had, as of 3 weeks ago, a legal marriage to a man she had met exactly once for 40 minutes, over a video call that kept buffering. His name was Donovan Marsh. He was 34. He raised cattle on 300 acres north of Claresholm and apparently hadn't been to the city in 2 years. He'd said maybe 5 sentences during their call, all of them practical. "The winters are harsh. I need help with the books. I'm not looking for anything complicated." He'd been looking slightly off camera the whole time, like the conversation embarrassed him. She'd thought, watching him, that he looked like a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to want something. She hadn't told her mother the whole truth. She'd said it was a work placement, a rural residency, something that sounded intentional and forward-moving instead of what it actually was. The only door she could find when everything else had closed. The truck turned off the gravel and onto a narrower track, and then there was a house in the distance. Not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. It was old but not crumbling. White paint that had gone a little gray at the edges. A covered porch. A barn further back, red, which is always the color of barns in stories even when they aren't in real life, but this one was. A dog lying on the front steps who didn't bother to lift his head when the truck pulled up. Donovan Marsh was standing at the edge of the porch. Arms crossed, not in a hostile way exactly, more like he was cold and hadn't thought to go inside. He was taller than the camera had made him seem, dark-haired, sharp-jawed, with the particular look of a person who spent most of his time outdoors and had stopped noticing it. He was wearing a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, and his boots were muddy, and he watched her climb out of the truck the way you'd watch weather coming in from the not alarmed, just noting it. "Vivienne," he said. Not a question. "Donovan," she said. The driver set her bags on the ground and got back in the truck and left. The dog still hadn't moved. "That's Biscuit," Donovan said, nodding at the dog. "He's not unfriendly. Just old." She looked at the dog. The dog looked at her with one open eye. "I've made up the room at the end of the hall," Donovan said, "second door on the right. Bathroom's across from it. I usually eat at 6:30. There's coffee if you want it." He paused. "I'll get your bags." He picked up both of her bags. They were heavy, she knew they were heavy, without any particular expression, and carried them inside. She followed him through the front door into a hallway that smelled like wood smoke and something cooking, and she stood for a moment in the entrance of this strange house on this flat, open land under the enormous sky and thought, with a clarity that surprised her. Okay, so this is it. She would think about that moment later. The specific feeling of it. Not fear, not exactly. Something more like a drawer closing. The first week was strange in the way that all new places are strange before they become ordinary. She learned the layout of the house, which drawer had the good knives, which tap ran cold faster than the other, which floorboard outside the bathroom creaked if you stepped on the left side. She learned that Donovan was up at 5 every morning and outside by 5:15, and that he came in for coffee at 7 and didn't really talk until 8. She learned that he kept the books in a system that had made sense to whoever invented it, probably him, but no sense to anyone else, and that this was the thing he genuinely seemed to need help with. She fixed the books. It took her 4 days, working at the kitchen table with her laptop and 3 years' worth of receipts in a shoebox. When she showed him the new spreadsheet, he looked at it for a long time and then said, "Huh," and that was the most animated she'd seen him. She tried not to think too much about what her life had looked like 6 months ago. She tried not to think about Elliot, the engagement, the apartment, the particular way the silence had sounded after he'd told her he'd changed his mind. She tried not to think about how she'd sat in her mother's kitchen for 2 weeks afterward, eating her mother's the soup, and watching her mother try very hard not to say "I told you so," and how in some ways the trying was worse than if she'd just said it. She watered the kitchen windowsill herbs Donovan had clearly planted at some point, and then mostly forgotten. She figured out the riding lawnmower, though no one asked her to. She walked the property in the evenings when the light went golden and low, and the grass smelled like rain even when it hadn't rained, and she thought, "There are worse places to be starting over." Donovan noticed. Not in any way, he said directly. He wasn't that kind of person. But she'd catch him looking at her sometimes from across a room with an expression like he was trying to work something out and hadn't quite gotten there. "You didn't have to do the lawn," he said one evening. "I know you're not here to do lawn work. I wasn't doing it because I thought I had to. I was doing it because I needed something to do with my hands." He looked at her for a moment. Fair enough. That was the longest conversation they'd had that wasn't about the books. The first sign of trouble came on a Thursday in late October, about 6 weeks in. She'd driven into Claire's home for groceries. Donovan had offered to come. She'd said she was fine. She'd been to the store twice now and knew the way, and when she got back, there was a dark blue pickup she didn't recognize in the driveway. She sat in the truck for a moment before going in. Nothing specific to worry about, she told herself. Could be anyone. The man in the kitchen was maybe 60. With a face like old leather and eyes that were doing something unfriendly while pretending not to. His name, she learned quickly, was Randall Tice. He had land adjoining Donovan's to the north. He had, apparently, been trying to buy that land for several years, and Donovan had been saying no for several years, and the arrangement had not been improving either man's opinion of the other. She walked in with the groceries, and Randall Tice looked at her the way you'd look at a card someone played that you hadn't expected. "Didn't know you had company," he said to Donovan. "She's not company," Donovan said, in a flat voice that didn't leave much room for interpretation. "This is Vivienne, my wife." Randall Tice smiled at her in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said, "isn't that something?" After he left, she put the groceries away in silence, and Donovan stood by the window watching the pickup pull out. "How long has he been after the land?" she asked. "Long enough. What does he want it for?" Donovan turned from the window. "He wants everything that's next to whatever he already has. That's the kind of man he is." She thought about that. Is there any legal issue with it? The property line, the deed? He looked at her. "Why do you know to ask that?" "My grandfather had a dispute about a fence line for 11 years. I grew up hearing about it at every family dinner." Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not quite a smile. "The deed's clean. The issue is that he's been telling people I won't be able to keep the land. That I'll have to sell eventually." He paused. People believe it when someone says something with enough confidence. She understood that. She understood it in her bones. "Well," she said, "then we make sure they have other things to believe." She hadn't meant to become known in town. It happened the way most things happened in small places, which is gradually and then suddenly. She'd started going to the Tuesday market in the fall when the vendors were packing it in for the season, just to have somewhere to be. She'd bought preserves and honey, and a very ugly ceramic mug she'd loved immediately. People talked to her the way Canadians talk to strangers, which is to say carefully and warmly, and with genuine interest in whether you were cold, whether you'd found the good coffee shop yet, whether you'd been here long. She told people she'd come from Halifax. She told them she was married to Donovan Marsh. She watched their faces when she said the second thing and learned a lot from the pauses. He wasn't disliked, exactly, but he was a person who had stopped participating somewhere along the line, and people in small places noticed participation. His wife had died 4 years ago. She'd learned this not from him, but from a woman named Bet at the market, who'd said it in the tone of someone explaining a thing they thought she deserved to know. He was different before. He's not a bad man. He just got very quiet. She hadn't told Donovan that she knew. She didn't think he'd want her to know, and she didn't want to make him feel like something she was managing. But she thought about it sometimes at night in the room at the end of the hall, with the wind coming off the fields, and she thought, that's what that expression is. The one when he looks at you and doesn't know what to do with what he sees. She didn't push. She was not, by nature, a pusher. She put the herbs back on the windowsill in a slightly better arrangement, and she fixed the bookkeeping, and she went to town on Tuesdays, and she cooked dinner on the nights he worked late, and she let the months do what months do when you stop fighting them. By December, she had learned that he took his coffee with just a little too much milk, that he never listened to music while he worked, but always had the radio on low in the evenings, that he had a way of standing in the barn doorway in the late afternoon, looking out at the fields with his hands in his jacket pockets, that made her want to ask what he was thinking, and also made her feel like asking would ruin whatever it was. She bought him a small thing for Christmas, a new thermos, because his old one had a crack in the lid she'd noticed him ignoring. She put it on the kitchen table on the 23rd because she was going to her mother's for the holiday, and she didn't want to make it a whole thing. He looked at it for a moment and then at her. "You didn't need to," he said. "I know, Vivienne. It's a thermos, Donovan. Don't make it into something it isn't." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," she said. She drove to Halifax. She spent 4 days at her mother's table, eating her mother's cooking, and letting her mother believe, for now, the version of the story that was easiest. On the 27th, she drove back. She wasn't sure, for the entire 6-hour drive, whether to examine too closely the feeling that made her drive faster the closer she got. January brought snow, which she'd been told would happen, and still was somehow not prepared for. The kind of snow that doesn't apologize for itself. She learned to check the forecast every morning like a religion. She learned to keep the truck topped up with gas, and to carry a bag in the back with extra layers and emergency supplies the way Donovan had shown her without making it feel like a lecture. The situation with Randall Tice got worse in the way these things get worse, which is incrementally, and then in a way that couldn't be ignored. There was a survey dispute. Documents he'd apparently filed, claiming a portion of Donovan's fence line sat several meters onto land that had historically been contested. It was, as far as she could tell when she read through the paperwork, a manufactured dispute, but manufactured things have teeth when someone has the resources and the patience to press them. Donovan had both a lawyer and a temper, and the combinations was not serving him well. She read everything. She made notes. She called her cousin in Calgary, who worked in property law, and asked hypothetical questions in a very careful voice. "This is him trying to exhaust you," she told Donovan one evening at the kitchen table with the documents between them. "He doesn't actually think he can win this. He thinks if he makes it expensive and slow and stressful enough, you'll decide it isn't worth it." Donovan was looking at the page in front of him, but she could tell he wasn't reading it. "I know what he's doing." "Then stop responding like you're angry. Start responding like you're bored." He looked up at her. "Anger tells him it's working," she said. "Boredom tells him you have all the time in the world. Which one do you want him to think?" A long pause. "How do you know this?" "Same way I know anything. I paid attention when the adults were talking, and I read a lot, and I had one very bad year that turned out to be educational in ways I didn't expect." He was quiet in the particular way he was quiet when he was thinking. "I'll talk to the lawyer again," he said. "Tell him to slow down. Good, Vivienne." She looked up. "Thank you," he said. Simple, plainly meant. The kind of thank you that didn't require a response, so she just nodded, and they went back to the papers. The moment she understood that something had changed came in February, which is typically the worst month for clarity in Alberta, because the weather is brutal and the days are short, and the cold has a way of making everything feel more serious than it is. She'd been outside checking the fence on the east side. Something Donovan did periodically, and she'd started coming with him, because the walking was good, and the conversation was off surprisingly fine, and she'd slipped on a patch of ice that looked like ground and gone down hard on her left side. Nothing broken. She could tell immediately, the way you can when your body informs you, it's mostly just insulted. But she'd grabbed Donovan's sleeve on the way down and he'd caught her arm, and they'd ended up closer together than they'd been since the day she arrived. He held her arm while she got her footing. His hand was very steady. She could feel it through the layers of her coat. "Okay," he said. "Fine," she said. Embarrassing, but fine. He didn't let go right away. She noticed that. She suspected he noticed it too, because something shifted in his expression, not panic, but awareness. The kind of awareness you feel when you've been doing something unconsciously, and you suddenly realize you're doing it. He let go. They walked back to the house. Neither of them mentioned it. But that evening at dinner, he asked her about Halifax in a way he hadn't before. Not the practical questions about the drive or the geography, but about what it was like, what she'd loved about it, what she'd found difficult. She told him about the fog in the mornings and the way the harbor looked in October, and about a coffee shop on Barrington Street, where she'd written most of her thesis. He listened in the full way he did things, which was complete and unhurried, and he asked a question that told her he'd actually heard what she'd said. She told him about Elliot, not all of it, but enough, that there had been someone, that it had ended badly, that she'd been in the particular kind of shock that comes from thinking you knew your own life and finding out you didn't. She didn't make it dramatic. It was just information, she told herself, just filling in a gap. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "That sounds like it cost you something." "It did," she said. "But I think I was getting some things wrong already. He just made it easier to see." "What kind of things?" She thought about it. "I was trying very hard to want a specific life, and I thought I'd found it, and I hadn't. And instead of feeling sad about that, I think I mostly just felt relieved." "Which probably tells you something." Donovan looked at the middle distance for a moment. "I know what that's like," he said. "The relieved part." She didn't ask what he meant. She thought about it afterward, though. She thought about it for a long time. The thing with Randall Tice finally broke open in March. He'd been telling people in town that Donovan's operation was in trouble, that he was overextended, that the land deal was just the beginning. It wasn't true. She knew the books better than anyone by now, and the numbers were tight but solid. But truth was only one of the things that mattered in a place where people talked to each other every week at the market and at the hockey rink and at the United Church Hall. The story that was spreading, she gathered, was this: that the marriage was a desperation move. That Donovan had brought her in from somewhere else because he couldn't manage on his own. That the whole operation was one bad season from collapse. She found out about it on a Tuesday. From Bet, who told her in the gentle and slightly apologetic way of someone who thought she deserved to hear it from a friend rather than a stranger. She drove home in a very particular kind of quiet. Donovan was in the barn when she got there. She waited until he came in, and then she told him what she'd heard. She was careful about her voice. She wasn't angry on her own behalf. She'd been called worse and survived it, but she was angry on his behalf in a way that surprised her with its intensity. "I'm sorry," he said when she'd finished. He was looking at the kitchen table. "You didn't come here for this. That's not the point, Donovan." "I know what the point is." "Do you? Because you look like you're about to make this into something private when it isn't. He's doing this because he thinks no one will push back. And you want to push back. I think we should go to the spring market on Saturday," she said. "Both of us. I think we should talk to people and be seen and let everyone see that everything is fine, because it is fine, and the only way to answer a rumor is to make the truth too obvious to ignore." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. She didn't know exactly what he'd expected. She thought about the 40-minute video call, the buffering, the way he'd looked slightly off camera. "What did you expect?" A pause. "Someone who'd leave by Christmas. It's March, I know it's March." Something in the air between them that she didn't try to name. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he agreed. They went to the market, they talked to people. She talked, mostly, which surprised no one who knew her by now and surprised Donovan more than he showed. She introduced him to the vendor she'd been buying honey from since October, which made the vendor laugh and say she'd been wondering when she'd meet Vivienne's husband. Donovan shook hands and answered questions and stood next to her in a way that was easy and solid, and she thought, watching him talk to an older man about the spring thaw, "He's not someone who can't do this. He's just someone who stopped." Word travels the same way it always travels. It took about 3 weeks for the tone to shift. She could feel it when she went to town, the way a weather vane swings, and you know the wind has changed even before you know what it means. Randall Tice was still there, still the same, but a person who is trying to create a story loses some power when the story refuses to cooperate. In April, the lawsuit was quietly dropped. Donovan got a letter from Tice's lawyer and read it at the kitchen table with a face that gave nothing away, and then set it down and said, "He blinked." "Good," she said. "Vivienne, I'm not going to say I told you so. I know you're not." She looked up at him. He was still looking at the letter, but he was almost smiling. She'd seen it a few times now, the almost smile, and each time it did something to her she was choosing not to examine closely. She wasn't sure when she stopped thinking of her room as the room at the end of the hall and started thinking of it as her room. It was a gradual thing, like everything in this place. She put a photograph on the windowsill. Her and her sister at the Cape Breton Highlands, from 3 summers ago, both of them squinting into the sun and laughing at something off camera she couldn't remember now. She put the ugly ceramic mug from the market on the bookshelf. She bought a small bookshelf from a shop in Claresholm and carried it up to the room herself and filled it with the paperbacks she'd brought from Halifax, and a few she'd found in a box in the living room that she suspected had been there for years. Donovan noticed the bookshelf. He paused in the doorway of her room one evening when she'd left the door open. She'd gotten into the habit of leaving it open. The house felt less large that way, and looked at it. "Some of those are mine," he said. "I know. I found them in a box. I thought they'd rather be read." He looked at the shelf for a moment. "You read fast. I've been here since October." "That's true." He leaned against the doorframe. He looked, she thought, like a person who was deciding something. "What's the one on the end?" "Alice Munro." "Have you read her?" "Years ago. Writes about small places and people who stay and people who leave and why. Sounds like something you'd like." "It is." He stood there for another moment. He said, "I'm glad you stayed past Christmas." She held that for a second. "Me too," she said. He nodded once. The particular nod of a man who has said the thing he meant to say and considers the matter addressed, and then walked back down the hall. She listened to his footsteps, and then to the quiet, and then to the wind outside the window, and she sat on her bed with the Alice Munro in her lap and didn't read a single word of it for a very long time. It was a Tuesday evening in late May when everything shifted for the last time. She'd been out walking the east field, the same one where she'd slipped on the ice in February, and she'd stopped at the fence line to watch the last of the light go out of the sky. The Alberta sky in spring at dusk is something she hadn't had words for yet and suspected she might not find words for in any language she knew. It was pink and gold, and then a blue so deep it was almost green at the edges, and it went on so far in every direction that she felt, standing in the middle of it, both very small and very present. Both things at once, which was new. She heard him before she saw him, his boots on the packed earth, the particular rhythm of him, which she knew now without having to think about it. "I thought you'd be inside by now," he said, coming to stand beside her. "I couldn't leave yet." He stood next to her and looked out at the same sky. For a long moment neither of them spoke, and it wasn't a silence that needed filling. It was the kind of silence that two people only have together when they've stopped performing at each other. "I owe you something," he said finally. "You don't owe me anything. I was not a generous person when you got here," he said. "I had reasons, but reasons aren't the same as excuses, Donovan. I'm trying to say something, I know. I'm listening." He was looking at the sky still. "I didn't think this could be real," he said. "This kind of arrangement. I thought at best it would be functional, and that would have to be enough." A pause. "I don't think functional is enough anymore." Her heart was doing something she was trying not to pay too much attention to. "What do you think would be enough?" He turned then and looked at her with that expression she'd been trying to read since October, and finally, standing there in the last light over the field, she read it. Not solved it, not closed it, but read it. The way you read the opening line of a book and know already that you're going to want to stay up late for this one. "I think this," he said. "I think this is enough." She could have said several things. She could have been cautious, could have protected herself the way she'd been protecting herself for the better part of a year. She could have said, "Let's be careful," or "Let's be sure," or any of the other sensible things she had told herself she would say if she ever found herself standing in a field in Alberta at dusk with a man she hadn't planned on. She said, "I think so too." He was not a man who moved quickly toward things. But he reached out and took her hand, standing there in that enormous sky, and held it the way you hold something you are not planning to put down. The summer came in slow and certain, the way good things do. She called her mother in June, the real conversation this time, the one she'd been putting off. Her mother was quiet for a long time and then said, with the particular generosity of someone who had been right about something and was choosing not to say so, "You sound like yourself again." Vivienne hadn't known until she heard those words how much she'd needed someone to say them. Biscuit, the old dog, developed a habit of following her when she walked the property in the evenings. Donovan said this was unprecedented. She'd said she thought Biscuit just had good judgment. Donovan said dryly that this was one theory. Randall Tice bought a piece of land in another county and mostly stopped being a problem, which was the most satisfying kind of resolution. Not dramatic, just gone. She redesigned the kitchen garden in August, and Donovan let her do it without comment, except to ask one morning what those small purple flowers were called at the edges of the beds. She told him they were lavender. He said, "Huh," in the tone of a man encountering something he hadn't known he would like, and went back to his coffee. In September, exactly a year after she'd arrived, she stood on the porch in the early morning with coffee in the ugly ceramic mug from the market, watching the light come up slow and pink over the fields. Donovan came out behind her and stood with his own coffee, and didn't say anything for a while, the two of them watching the morning arrive. "You know what I keep thinking?" she said. "What? That I made a very impulsive decision on very bad information at a very hard time in my life." A pause. "And somehow it was the right one." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, you fixed the books and told me to be bored instead of angry and convinced the whole town that everything was fine when I couldn't see how to do any of those things myself." He took a sip of coffee. "I think the information was fine. I think you knew more than you thought you did." She looked at him. He was watching the fields in that way he had, patient, steady, like he had nowhere else to be. She thought, this is what it feels like when you stop trying to want a different life. When you let the one you're actually living be the one you choose. The light kept coming. The fields went gold. Biscuit lifted his head from his spot by the door, decided there was nothing requiring his attention, and went back to sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a fence needed walking. They'd get to it.